The Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, Game Boy Color, Game Gear, Atari Lynx, WonderSwan and Neo Geo Pocket Color are all classic handheld game consoles from our past. But what if there was simply one cartridge-based handheld to rule them all that was compatible with the libraries of these legendary systems? Well, that is precisely what the handhelds we shall be discussing today is capable of. So with that said, join me as we discuss the Rolls-Royce of retro gaming handhelds and look at the awesomeness that this delight is capable of. I am Lady Decade and this is the Analogue Pocket. As 2021 wound down, Analogue Incorporated fulfilled its commitment to releasing a wunderkind handheld with its own custom operating system to bring classic 1980s and 1990s gaming into the modern era. Known as the Analogue Pocket, the FPGA-powered handheld was a tantalizing offering. Analogue has constantly prided itself on its high-end consoles, beginning with the CMVS, standing for Consoleized MVS. The first console appeared in 2011 in an infamous wood grain design launched for an impressively high $650, almost on par with the infamously high costs of the Neo Geo line of consoles. The MVS was the arcade line that brought swappable cartridges to standing cabinets, allowing owners to quickly change out a game in an ever-present arcade machine or have multiple arcade titles in one device. Coincidentally, Neo Geo would pivot to the home market with the advanced entertainment system, providing the same power to home players. But at the time of the launch of the CMVS, the arcade cartridges were actually trending cheaper than the home cartridges, so a consoleized arcade machine would be an affordable way to bring arcade action authentically home. Analogue would pivot to a slim variant, but both repurposed existing SNK produced hardware into a new shell with new connections. Using this as a basis for a burgeoning retro boutique business, Analogue would perform the same trick with the Analogue NT, bringing Nintendo Entertainment System and Famicom cartridges together in 2015 with one piece of hardware. If you can recall, the international model of Nintendo's iconic 8-bit console had different cartridge connectors, so a dual slot system was implemented, and damaged Famicom consoles were salvaged as the base for the console, which was placed in a new solid aluminium unibody enclosure with even a 24-karat gold plated limited run available for $5,000. This embodied a retro games console for only the wealthiest elitists. Bougie. Realizing that there were only so many Famicom consoles out there and there's a certain stigma about breaking apart actual hardware for a new business, Analogue would explore the field programmable gate array concept for their hardware solutions. While we're not a technical channel, at a high level the FPGA concept effectively emulates the actual hardware of a piece of hardware, and not just the code that would allow the game to run on, say, your stock computer. While coming at a higher cost than the general purpose circuits, purists will swear that this provides for a much more accurate replication of gaming as seen on the original hardware. Let's just say hardware a few more times for good measure. Hardware. But anyway, I mean, you're playing the revised NT Mini with HDMI out and wireless controllers, so a fair amount of tradition has been thrown out the window. With the Neo Geo and 8-bit consoles now handheld, Analogue proceeded to release new consoles with a certain general aesthetic, committing to the FPGA mindset but reducing costs by using more straightforward and cheaper plastic molds than the previous wood grain and metal releases. The Mega SG and Super NT would be released, committing to 16-bit Sega Genesis, Mega Drive and 16-bit Super Nintendo and Super Famicom consoles. They'd be effectively limited to HDMI output with the exception of an adapter, come with the standard 2-player controller ports despite the Analogue NT having 4-player support out the box, and in the case of the Mega SG, connections to the original Sega CD/Mega CD support. support. Players might still be a bit disappointed that the 32X isn't supported thanks to the relatively janky way the console output video footage and original CD drives for the blast processing machine are drying up. But in a reverse turn of fortune, Analogue never made a Master System console but instead created a trio of adapters to allow Game Gear cartridges, miCards, Mark III cartridges and SG-1000 cartridges. Effectively, most of the non-CD consoles of Sega's past can all be played on one device. Skipping to the future, or more accurately later this year if all goes according to plan, Analogue is now developing their first CD-ROM powered device, with the future Analogue Duo adapting the PC Engine and TurboGrafx-16 libraries into a Turbo Duo inspired shell and format. But these are all home consoles I've rambled on about, and outside of the Super Game Boy support via the classic Nintendo adapters for the Super NT and Game Gear support via their in-house adapter for the Mega SG, they hadn't touched the handheld market until the announcement of the Analogue Pocket on the 16th of October 2019. While there were a few delays thanks to the pandemic-induced chip shortage that could be felt all across electronic production lines, the handhelds would be released near the end of 2021, just in time for Christmas if you were one of the lucky ones. To the brass tacks, the Analogue Pocket features a 3.5-inch backlit screen at 1600 by 1440, precisely 10 times that of the console you most likely see when you look at the device, the Game Boy and Game Boy Color. The vertical orientation of the device features 4 face buttons and 2 shoulder buttons, alongside a variety of menu, volume and other multi-purpose buttons, located on the back around the cartridge slots that's natively designed for Game Boy, Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance cartridges. Much like the Mega SG and its litany of Sega adapters, the handheld can also use its own series of adapters to take on Game Gear, Neo Geo Pocket, Neo Geo Pocket Color and Atari Lynx games, turning the device into a full gauntlet of handheld legends. Maybe one day R-Zone, WonderSwan and Megaduck cartridges could be supported. A woman can only dream of a cougar boy with a refreshed body. It is reassuring that the Neo Geo Pocket Color and Atari Lynx are finally getting the respect they deserve thanks to various collections and re-releases. Still, with the Analogue Pocket, we can go one step further and put the system's physical cartridges to good use in a shiny modern system. While the console is very future focused, with a custom Analogue OS that has received updates and looks to be used across their products, a classic 3.5mm headphone jack and link cable allows for Pokemon transfers and private music listening. It's an all-around impressive piece of kit. While playing on a high-resolution screen as a treat, you can also replicate the original console's pixel grid patterns and LCD feelings. But remember how the previous consoles embraced the HDMI output standard? Thanks to the USB-C charging and data port at the bottom, players can purchase an additional dock, allowing players to output to a television or capture card. With the dock's connectivity, they can use any retro-inspired USB or wireless controllers to bring these games to the big screen. So, if you really want to play the Game Gear port of Woody Pop on the big screen with a PlayStation 5 DualSense controller, such a dream can be a reality. One port we've not discussed in this console is perhaps the most magical, the handheld's micro SD slot. Officially, there's not going to be much going on there right now. Natively, the console doesn't back up titles to it, but thanks to the GB Studio software, players can drag and drop indie titles into the system. That's all good, but Analogue has a history of quote-unquote independent developers frequently releasing custom firmware that unlocks the true power of the handheld on the same day as the console's release. Following some rather handy tutorials found online, you can unlock the Analogue Pocket's true power by installing a range of extremely excellent FPGA cores. This means that you can not only play classic handheld games on the system, system without inserting the cartridges, but it expands the system's use past the handhelds it already supports. Generally, suppose it's a well-known 16-bit platform or earlier. In that case, it can likely be enjoyed using the Analogue Pocket. Want to play Super Metroid or Star Fox for the Super Nintendo on the go? Then the Analogue Pocket has you covered. Playing classic Super Nintendo and Sega Mega Drive games using the hardware almost felt like it grew new life. The Analogue Pocket is such a comfortable handheld, and paired with the absolutely amazing screen and the high quality of the controls, it feels like the perfect platform to be playing these classic games on. The Analogue Pocket reeks of a style and class, and the handheld control scheme is ideal for games from this era. Once released, the Analogue Pocket received significant praise from gaming journalists and various design awards. Fast Company would mention it in their Best Design Innovations of 2020 in the North America region and in the Best Product Design of 2020. It was also the Red Dot winner of 2022, with the jury stating, "Analogue Pocket offers retro gamers a technically sophisticated handheld console. Though the design borrows from the classic Game Boy, it is successfully translated into a slim, contemporary form." More traditional outlets would praise it from a classic gaming perspective. IGN would highlight it by pointing out, "I've never seen my old handheld cartridges look as good as they do on the Analogue Pocket. Playing original software on original hardware is great, especially for retro purists. But there are some definite trade-offs when you slam your copy of Pokemon Red into an OG Game Boy. There's no backlight, batteries require constant babysitting, sound is less than stellar. The Analogue Pocket solves the limitations of the Game Boy, Game Boy Advance and other handhelds of yore, and it does so with a familiar but distinct style you don't find with emulation-based solutions. In other words, the Analogue Pocket is the best possible way to enjoy your handheld gaming collection." Looking at these reviews, I wholeheartedly agree with much of the positivity that this device has been showered with. For many game collectors out there, you may have had your old Game Boy or Game Gear cartridges simply gathering dust on a shelf somewhere, as let's be honest, the screens of those classic systems look far from great today. The Analogue Pocket not only stops these old cartridges from being somewhat obsolete, but playing them on the Analogue Pocket allows them to look better than ever before. In my opinion, this really is currently the best way to play these retro games. While the price tag may put you off investing in one of these devices to call your own, even if you do not already have a deep handheld cartridge library, if you're a fan of retro gaming, the Analogue Pocket may still serve as a valuable product to you. This is because the system's excellent build quality and ability to allow us to play classic games using FPGA cores helps deliver one of the most outstanding gaming on the go experiences that money can buy. If you enjoyed this one, why not check out last week's episode when we discussed the Evercade. See you soon.